In March of 2019, I made a video about the then released 3rd generation iPad Air, comparing it to the 11-inch 2018 iPad Pro, coming to the conclusion that, for most people, the iPad Air was the best value for money option when comparing the much more expensive iPad Pro when it comes to value for money in terms of the features you get for the price you have to pay. However, this year I thought it would be very appropriate to compare the brand new 2020 iPad Air 4th generation to the 2020 11-inch iPad Pro. And for most people, especially this time around with the brand new design that the iPad Air 4 brings, the iPad Air is just the better buy for most people, especially considering the $200 price savings. So without any further ado, my name's Ramal, and in this video I'll be telling you why the iPad Air 4 is basically the perfect iPad for most people. So let's get right into it. The 4th generation iPad Air brings with it the 2020 and 2018 iPad Pro design, with the flat edges, squared off design, and no home button, resulting in a larger 10.9-inch screen. The iPad Air 4 also brings with it a brand new USB-C connector, replacing the aging Lightning port and enabling you to use external drives and other wired peripherals with your iPad Air, making it that bit more pro. It also brings support for the 2nd generation Apple Pencil, which is hands down the better version of the Apple Pencil, especially comparing it to the 1st generation Apple Pencil that you had to, just like plug it into the Lightning port. Look, it was a mess. Let's just forget about it because the iPad Air 4 finally has support for the magnetically attaching inductive charging Apple Pencil 2. Also, let's not forget about the new color options for the iPad Air. So we have these standard space gray, silver, and rose gold options that we've seen before on other Apple products, but for the first time ever on any iPad, we have a brand new green color, which I think looks really nice, and also my favorite, sky blue. Now, as you might have already noticed, I'm a very big fan of the color blue, but not really lighter shades. I'm more of a deep, saturated, more punchy blue person. But I don't know what Apple's done with their sky blue color option for the iPad Air, but it just hits different for me. I don't know why, but it just looks really classy and understated, which I guess is kind of a good look. So I wouldn't blame you for thinking at this point that Apple is willingly compromising their sales of the 2020 11-inch iPad Pro with this new iPad Air 4, especially with its new industrial design similar to the iPad Pro, along with all of the features that it shares with the iPad Pro, like the most important one, the ability to run iPad OS, which is basically better than ever at this point, and has the ability to replace your computer with an iPad. However, despite all this, Apple has still found ways to cripple the iPad Air in a few areas just to keep the market share of the 11-inch iPad Pro, but personally I don't think that these particular compromises mean that much to the average consumer or for a student or anyone who's really looking to buy a pro-level iPad without shelling out pro-level money. So let's get into a few of these differences, or rather a few that I think many people might notice when they compare these two head to head. So the iPad Air 4 has a 10.9-inch 60Hz Retina display, whereas the iPad Pro has the 120Hz 11-inch Retina display. Personally, I think this is one of the main differences that people are most likely to see in terms of a head-to-head comparison, because the 120Hz display on the iPad Pro does make it feel faster than the iPad Air, even though it may not necessarily be faster. However, the 60Hz display on the iPad Air does still work completely fine when it comes to doing stuff like word processing, note-taking, light work, and even when it comes to content consumption and light gaming. So it's not too big of a deal, but you really have to consider whether 120Hz is worth $200 over the iPad Air for the iPad Pro. The iPad Air also has 2 speakers instead of the 4 found on the iPad Pro. However, this time it isn't really that big of a deal because the speakers on the iPad Air are landscape oriented in a stereo pair, meaning that they're on either side of the device as opposed to iPad Airs and iPads of the past where the speakers were only on one side. So the stereo immersion should be fine, but not as good as the iPad Pro, but definitely better than any iPad Airs of the past. In the camera department, the iPad Air has only one rear-facing camera, which is a standard 12-megapixel wide-angle camera, whereas the iPad Pro has 2 cameras, one being the standard 12-megapixel wide-angle and a 10-megapixel ultra-wide, along with a LiDAR sensor and a flash. Now, I'm not really an iPad videographer or photographer, so the fact that the iPad Air only has one rear-facing camera doesn't bother me too much. But the fact remains that the iPad Pro has an ultra-wide camera and a flash as well, along with the LiDAR sensor. But personally, I don't really find those useful at all. And an ultra-wide camera on an iPad, I think, makes less sense than a telephoto camera on an iPad, especially when, sitting in classrooms, taking pictures of the whiteboard or lecture notes on a PowerPoint presentation or whatever. So it doesn't really make that much sense for me personally. But tangents aside, I think the single camera on the iPad Air is fine, especially with the fact that it can record 4K video and do all of the bells and whistles that the iPad Pro can do on its main camera. Both iPads also have adequate front-facing cameras, but in terms of biometrics, the iPad Pro has Face ID, whereas the iPad Air has Touch ID. Now, the Touch ID on the iPad Air is built into the power button because there's no home button anymore on the newer design of the iPad Air. In terms of RAM, the iPad Air has 4 gigs, whereas the iPad Pro has 6 gigs. Now, that 4GB number isn't really confirmed at this point in time, but if it does change or if new information suggests otherwise, I'll leave an update in a pinned comment in the comments down below. But the more RAM you get on the iPad Pro should be more useful when it comes to multitasking, but in day-to-day use, there shouldn't really be that big of a difference if you don't have more than 5 or 6 apps open in the background. So it shouldn't really be too much of an issue for most people. Now, a very major difference between these two iPads is that the iPad Air has an A14 chip and the iPad Pro 11-inch has an A12Z chip. Now, this is quite strange, and I believe we haven't seen this before where the iPad Air has a more powerful chip than the iPad Pro. But names can be deceiving because the iPad Air has an iPhone-specific chip, whereas the iPad Pro, even though the chip in it is 2 generations behind, it is designed specifically for the iPad Pro. Now, in terms of real-world use, I don't think there's going to be too big of a difference between the iPad Air and the iPad Pro in terms of performance, because the iPad Air has an iPhone-specific chip, whereas the iPad Pro, even though it's 2 years behind in terms of its chip architecture, has an iPad-specific chip. Now, either way, both are going to be completely fine for whatever you throw at them. But at the end of the day, longevity should not be an issue for either device, and I would expect 5 years or even more when it comes to software updates on either device. Finally, when it comes to storage, I think this is the thing that might sway some people away from the iPad Air. So for $599, you get 64 gigs of base storage on the iPad Air, whereas for $799 on the iPad Pro, you get 128 gigs of storage. When it comes to storage space on an iPad, I think 64 gigs is definitely cutting it close. But if all you do on your iPad is note-taking, word processing, some slight productivity here and there, media consumption, and even slight gaming from time to time, 64 gigs should be enough, especially if most of the work you do is in the cloud, such as on Google Docs. But for anyone else who's really looking at using their iPad Air as a laptop replacement, I would highly consider looking at the 128GB base model 11-inch iPad Pro instead. This is because the next step up from 64 gigs on the iPad Air is 256, which costs $749. At this point, I would recommend that you at least have a look at the $799 base iPad Pro 11-inch with 128 gigs of storage, because I think 128 gigs is sufficient for most people because it's kind of a nice sweet spot in between 64 and 256. And also, by paying $50 more, you also get a few more creature comforts of the iPad Pro. However, if you absolutely need 256 gigs on an iPad, regardless which model you go for, I would much rather recommend the iPad Air, which is $150 cheaper at 256 gigs compared to the iPad Pro at 256, which costs $899. Now, regardless of which iPad Air you go for, you will be spending less than a comparably spec'd 11-inch iPad Pro, and that money you save can be spent on either an Apple Pencil or a keyboard case for the iPad Air. For this new iPad Air 4, you can get the Magic Keyboard at $299, but I really advise against that, especially considering that the Magic Keyboard literally costs half as much as the base model iPad Air. And instead, I recommend that you spend that money that you would ordinarily spend on a Magic Keyboard and buy the Logitech case with a trackpad built in and the Apple Pencil for less than the price of a Magic Keyboard on its own. All in all, I think this current 4th generation iPad Air is a stellar deal when you compare it to the 11-inch iPad Pro, especially with how much you're paying and how many features you're getting for that lower price tag. Anyway, thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. If you enjoyed or if I helped you in any capacity, make sure to give this video a huge thumbs up and subscribe and hit the notification bell for more tech content in the future. If you have any questions or suggestions for future content, make sure to leave those in the comments below and I'll try to get to as many as I can. And if you want me to make a video on the new 10.2-inch budget iPad, make sure to tell me in the comments below, because I think that iPad provides so much value, like an incredible amount of value at its price point, especially with its new chip and all the features that it brings along with those changes. So make sure to leave a comment down below if you're interested in coverage of that. But my name's Ramal, thank you so much for watching and I'll see you in the next one.